In 1914, you weren't a Canadian citizen. In 1914, you were either a British subject, you were a naturalized British subject, or you were unnaturalized. And it was the focus on these unnaturalized recent immigrants that was a concern for the Dominion government. Many of them now found themselves in Canada, not yet naturalized, and from countries that we were at war with. So not only were they alien to Canada, but they were now deemed enemy aliens.
Internment was an operation, military operation, that was undertaken by the government of Canada between the years 1914 and 1920. Essentially, some 8,579 so-called enemy aliens were interned in 24 camps across the country. These individuals were homesteaders here in Canada, and some of them, of course, were married, but most were single men.
Approximately 3,500 of those men were actual Austro-Hungarian reservists or merchant marine.
They estimate around 5,000 of those 5,500 were Ukrainian, and the others were Eastern Europeans, and a handful of from the Turkish Ottoman Empire.
It's here in Banff that during the First World War, there was actually a First World War internment camp. Not too many people know about this.
The internment camp in Banff, which would be Castle Mountain and Cave Basin, opened up in 1915 and closed 2 years later, 1917.
The barracks for the Banff camp are located just beside the bathing pavilion here at Cave Basin, down in the tree line beside us here. And these were basic, simple buildings above ground, and there's essentially nothing left. It was a temporary, they were temporary barracks built post on sill. There is a bit of terracing in and amongst the trees where the barracks were located, but 100 years later, the vegetation and trees have grown up and really obscured what was left.
The statue is that of an internee, and we've taken archival photographs. They wore a straw hat, they wore overalls. This is what they looked like. The plaque itself is trilingual. It's English, French, and Ukrainian, briefly describing that there was an internment operations, and that was the site of one of the 24 camps across Canada. The statue and bronze plaque were intentionally not placed at the campsite because there would be no artifacts left. And so from where the present statue and plaque, it's a 10-15 minute walk, but you'd have to know where it was. The statue and plaque that we unveiled in 1995 serves many purposes, in my view. One is to commemorate what happened in Canada during the First World War. It also serves as a reminder what happens when people's civil liberties are taken away from them. It also reminds Canadians that we don't have a pristine white history where we're all happy people that came to Canada and everything was great. There was a lot of racism. I've had people tell me that they can't believe this happened in Canada. They didn't know about it. They weren't taught about it in school. I've also had people tell me that sleeping dogs should continue sleeping and we should forget about this and move forward. And we should not think of the bad things that have happened in Canadian history. The Castle Mountain site was tents. If you take a look at the archival photographs, the internees and the soldiers that guarded them all lived in tents. And I've read stories where they say, well, you put 200 men in one big tent with 2 wooden stoves. It's pretty cold. And I don't think the soldiers fared much better for conditions. So I think everybody had a pretty rough time. They were supposed to receive a prisoner of war ration, and which was so many calories per day, but quite often they were unable to get that food and they were required to work. There was one internee, his name was Nikolinik, who wrote to his family is that we're hungry, we're cold, we're hungry, and we're as hungry as dogs. So it was pretty severe in some cases where people were not mistreated and beaten, but they weren't fed and clothed warm enough.
For the 2 years that the internees were here, there still are some vestiges of their labor on the landscape. Part of the road clearing that they did was on the 1A highway to Lake Louise. A few of the holes on the Banff Springs golf course were cleared in preparation by the internees. So there's a bit. I mean, the park had been around for quite a few years before, but they definitely did contribute to what we enjoy today.
Internment operations followed guidelines as established under the Hague Conventions, the 1899 Hague Conventions, which required ultimately that interning authorities pay these individuals as prisoners of war. So these individuals received a nominal wage of 25 cents a day, which was equivalent to the wage of a soldier, they received this nominal wage for one day's worth of work.
The families were left in very difficult situations. There was no support. There was actually scorn upon these families because they were enemy alien families.
There is no evidence of anyone doing anything that in any way, shape or form approximated sabotage or any of that nature.
They had their wealth taken away from them. They had their farms removed. They had their money out of their wallet taken away from them. Some of it was returned, some of it wasn't. They were just totally humiliated. And they went back home to wherever they were. Some of them had families, some didn't, and they had to start again.
We're here at the Eaton interment site. The monument behind us was a memorial that was erected in 2005. And it really sort of is a symbolic gesture to honor the memory of those 86 individuals that were brought here in the early spring of 1919. They were compelled to work on the railways, in effect fixing the railway beds, putting in new ties. The camp existed for no more than 28 days. It was a very short-lived camp. So these individuals were sent to Amherst with the view that they would eventually be deported. It's not clear from the records as to whether these individuals were in fact deported, although my suspicions are that they, in fact, a good percentage of them were. There's some 1,100 individuals who were in fact deported at the end of the war as so-called undesirables. The majority of these individuals that were held in 1918 after hostilities were individuals identified by internment authorities as malcontents, individuals in effect who had a gripe with the government of Canada, having spent some 4 years in an internment camp. And they were not to be trusted, and they continued to remain behind barbed wire with the idea that eventually they would be deported with the signing of the peace treaty.
These men were embarrassed. They were absolutely ashamed that this happened to them. And many of these men never spoke of it to their families. And why I say that they never spoke is because, in old age they would say, "I was interned," and their families would disbelieve them because how could this happen in Canada?
This is fundamentally a human rights story. The question of what we value most in this society, which is, our freedoms, our rights, our liberty. And it behooves us to remember in a place like this that, in fact, that this was taken away from people here in this place, which in effect values those very things. And so in some respects, what we need to always remember is the fragility of human rights, and that we need to be vigilant.